Something that's important to remember when it comes to the ancient Greek hoplites is that they were not a professional force, they were more akin to a citizen militia. Every male citizen from roughly the age of 18 to 60 was eligible for military service, and this meant that they had to afford and purchase their own equipment. The result of this would mean that you would see a lot of disparity in uniqueness and individuality within the hoplite phalanx, and many soldiers would not be able to adorn themselves in every piece of armour. Not even the Spartans were a professional force, as so commonly said to be. Now before me I've laid out the multitude of items from a hoplite's panoply or equipment, and we're going to go through it and explain to you some things about it. Let's start off with the helmets. Now, though the Corinthian helmet seems to be the iconic, typical Greek helmet, there were actually many others that coexisted with it and actually outlasted it. Before you there are 3 helmets, 2 of them being of the Corinthian type, and one of them being the Illyrian helmet, given its name because so many have been found around the city-state of Illyria. Now, though the Corinthian helmet was incredibly popular, so too was the Illyrian helmet, with around 1/3 of all archaeological finds being of this helmet type. There would have been even more helmets that you would have found alongside the Corinthian, such as the Chalcidian, and later you would see the Pylos helmet, the Attic helmet, the Thracian helmet, and even more. One of the most characteristic and defining factors of these helmets are the crests on top. Now before you can see 2 different styles of crests, the standard front to back and the transverse crest. There is one other typical design that we see, which is called the J crest, which comes up in a sort of candy cane-like hook. However, this design seems to fall out of favour coming into the classical age. You wouldn't have just seen crests on helmets, we have evidence of horns, antlers, and even entire horse tails. However, the art database does show that the crest seems to be the most common use. Now, unlike the Romans, we have next to no evidence at all suggesting that these had any rank indication, even the transverse crest, though it does seem to be rarer. Now, there are many reasons for this. For example, most hoplites depicted in art are from the side, and the only transverse crest depictions in pottery are from the front, which would automatically distort our perception of how common or uncommon these crests were. Now let's start with the Illyrian helmet. As I said, this helmet does seem to be a very popular design, and for good reason. It offers very good protection, however allows a lot of air and vision as opposed to the Corinthian. Now this, as always with armour, is a compromise, as typically the more vision and comfort you have, the less protective. However, this would still be very good, especially against slashes, as these cheek plates come out above your face. Now, we see many different types of Illyrians, however, all basically following the same pattern. We sometimes see, typically later on, they open up ears, and sometimes these cheek plates did not have a curve, they were completely straight. However, the basic foundation remained the same, and it was a very effective and favoured helmet. However, maybe not as iconic and epic looking as the Corinthian. Now, the next helmet I want to talk to you about is what we call the Hermione Corinthian, which is perhaps the stereotypical Corinthian helmet. Now, this was actually a later reform of the Corinthian helmet that we probably more likely saw at Thermopylae coming into play in the 5th century BC. This saw the most closed form of the Corinthian helmet, having very enclosed eyes and in very enclosed cheek plates, and this one here is adorned with a transverse crest. This was the most protective helmet that we probably ever saw the Greek hoplites wearing, and it likely came into play during the Persian invasion because of the amount of missile fire that the Greeks had to deal with. They favoured the more enclosed protective style. This helmet would stay around until around 450 BC, where it seems to start to drop out of popularity in favour for more open-faced helmets. Now, something else that you see here is that this has been painted with a checker pattern. We do have plenty of evidence suggesting that the Greeks painted their armour, including their helmets, and the checker pattern is one that we quite commonly see, typically on Chalcidian helmets, however also on some Corinthians. Now, the next helmet I want to talk to you about is this style here, which is commonly given the name the archaic Corinthian helmet. However, nearly all Corinthian helmets were archaic. This is sort of the one that was more likely going to be seen around the Battle of Marathon and Thermopylae, the sort of earliest style of the Corinthian helmet. You can see it doesn't have that very defined cranial ridge. The eyes on this example are slightly bigger. This is about the biggest we ever see in the archaeological record, and the cheek plates are sprayed slightly further apart. Now you can see that around the edges here there's decorative rivets. We do see this in the archaeological record, and we also have evidence for stitching holes for installing a liner. Now, as mentioned before, all of these helmets have different types of crests. However, we do not entirely know how these crests were constructed. Before you there are three different styles, one of them being one that's being quite favoured now in the reenactment world, which we'll have a closer look at now. Something that's so interesting about these crests is that though we have so many depictions, we have no surviving versions, which means that the construction method is left for us to try and figure out, and is very much so in the dark. This method of construction uses horsehair, which is accounted for in period sources. However, the crest box construction is actually leather, and the checker pattern that we so commonly see is how the crest is actually secured inside, with essentially the tufts of horsehair would have been curved into a U and stitched, weaved and connected with this crest box checker design. Something else that we do see in period art is these dots, which many of us have decided might represent beads, and not only does it look very nice, it also actually helps keep the hair up. Another feature that we see on these crests is a very long tail. Again, this is likely just for decoration and to look grand and intimidating. These crests, again, don't seem to serve any military purpose. They are more to make the hoplite look grand and intimidating and fierce and taller on the battlefield. And I think they did that incredibly well. The crest design of this helmet is perhaps the most common that you see in reenactment, which is a wooden crest box which has been painted to another design that we see commonly appearing in art, with small holes bored out that tufts are glued in. Now when it comes to these crests, again, as we have no surviving finds, it basically is up to speculation, and it's likely that we would have seen many construction methods. Uniformity was not a thing really in ancient Greece, and we can see that in many different styles in armour that we'll get onto, especially when we talk about the famed Linothorax or tube and yoke style armour. And the crest box was likely the same thing. Many of these would have probably had different organic constructions, from the leather weaved crest box that we see on the archaic style example, to this bored out wooden box, to even bone or weave. It's likely that they would have found many different ways to fasten these adorned crests. So there's a little bit on ancient Greek helmets, and I could go on for so much more. However, I think we should move on. Next, we're going to move on to two examples of body armour that we see throughout the archaic and classical world, starting with the muscle cuirass. Now, the muscle cuirass is a very famous example and a very typical example that we think of when talking about hoplites. However, the earliest evidence that we have for this style of armour coming in is about 490 BC. So this style of armour would have been very new in the time of the Persian Wars. Before that, I do not yet have an example of, however I am actually getting one made, of a belled cuirass, which is a far more archaic style, but probably more what you would have seen at the time of Leonidas, which looks something like this. There's also a sort of transitional period where you see the belled cuirass forming into the muscle cuirass. However, it is definitely not impossible that all of these helmets could have overlaid with the muscle cuirass, as again, these coexisted. Something that's incredibly important to note when we talk about armour is it didn't just suddenly drop and change. The same way that if you look at the Middle Ages, armour gradually came in and out of fashion. It wasn't a sudden deadline of, this is now the 5th century, not the 6th, therefore this armour is now in style. So it is highly possible that we would have seen an overlay in equipment, as this armour was incredibly expensive and each individual would have had to have bought his own stuff, which means that if one of these helmets, for instance the more archaic style, fit very well and he wanted a new cuirass, then it is highly possible that that helmet would have been worn with a newer styled cuirass. This style of armour would have been likely the most expensive, and it offered the most protection. We have actually done full-blown tests on this style of armour that shows that full-powered spear thrusts, if they even go through less than a millimetre. These would have had to have fitted very well, as the weight of armour does not just hang on the shoulders, it in fact fits the entire body. It essentially acts as a second skin. This also means that the armour, though it makes you heavier, doesn't necessarily feel too heavy in the period that you'll be wearing it for. And the way of attaching this armour is done so with pins, basically a hinge, that you will be pinned into. Now this style of armour would likely have only been worn by very rich individuals unless you managed to pillage one off of a dead body, and it did offer the most protection, and actually out of personal experience I find this more comfortable than the tube and yoke or Linothorax style armour. Though it may look very big and bulky, it actually doesn't restrict mobility that much, and in fact armour itself isn't very good if it does that. And throughout all of history, we see armour being tweaked and developed in order to grant very good mobility and protection at the same time. You're not simply a walking around tin can. If armour wasn't very good and it was difficult to move in and was very uncomfortable, then simply people wouldn't have worn it. It's attested throughout thousands of years of human development that armour did work, and it was better to have it than not. Next, let's move on to perhaps the most typical and seen style of armour in the hoplite's time, that being the tube and yoke, or famously Linothorax. Similar to the crest box, we are very much left in the dark in the ways of construction, and basically all of our modern reproductions are, to a part, a theory. We have very few surviving finds, and most of them are Macedonian, if they do, one of them being fully metal. And that's one of the issues when it comes to recreating ancient Greek armour, is that lots of it doesn't survive, especially the organic stuff. This has led to two main theories, that being that the Linothorax or tube and yoke was of a linen construction or a leather one, which is commonly called a spolas. Now, we have literacy attesting to both. The name itself is a modern construction, and likely many of these names that we give them, the Greeks would have simply called a helmet or a cuirass or a breastplate. The sort of modern listing of armour doesn't really take place at the time, except I believe Corinthian helmets are actually called Corinthian helmets. This armour is by far the most commonly depicted at the time, and we're likely looking at multiple different construction methods as usual. The Linothorax, or the tube and yoke, which was made up of the tube, the torso and the yoke, the shoulders, was likely a blueprint that many different materials were used to create. This example here is that of glued layered linen, which creates a very stiff and sturdy armour, however isn't necessarily the most practical at stopping stabs. Another theory that we have is unglued quilted linen, or even layered linen, which upon testing can stop a full-powered spear blow. We also see the addition of scales on certain armours, especially around the midsection and the sides, and we even see some fully coat the entire armour. We also have some surviving being of leather, and it's pretty safe to assume that these would have again been made of multiple different materials. One style that I myself want to have a go at making is having the yokes, the shoulders, out of a thick leather material, and the core being out of a layered linen with scales, which the scales, adding protection, allowed the layered linen far more mobility. Another aspect that we see on these are what we call pteryges, which basically translates as feathers, which hang down below the legs. Now these are very mobile, but they do offer some protection for the bottom half. We do sometimes see these attached to the cuirass, and possibly worn as a belt underneath as well. What's interesting about the tube and yoke is that it basically survives all periods of ancient Greek history, coming in the Archaic period and going through well into the Hellenistic, and you can even see lots of Roman-style armours, again being that tube and yoke design, for instance the Lorica Hamata. Now next we're going to be talking about sidearms or swords. Now in the Greek time we really have two main ones that we can talk about, that being the ksiphos and the kopis, being a slightly larger, more of a chopper. This here is an example of a ksiphos, a particular small example which seems to be favoured by the Lacedaemonians, especially in the time of the Peloponnesian War. This, as you can see, is quite a small blade, and it's very agile and very good at multitasking. It's a good stabber and a good slasher. You can imagine that in close quarters, when the phalanxes clash together, or when you get up close and your spears break or are lost, that this type of weapon would have been absolutely ruthless. The small and agile design would have allowed you to get through eye holes and neck holes and get into all those nooks and crannies that the otherwise pretty well protected hoplites have uncovered. Another sword that we see the Greeks use is what's called a kopis, which is similar to the falcata. This is a heavy front-weighted blade, though that doesn't mean that the blade itself is heavy, more that its balance point is closer forward, which allows for optimized cutting. Though this sword is very much told to be a cutting sword, that does not mean that it could not be stabbed with. In fact, this would have also delivered a very powerful stab. Another important aspect of the hoplite's panoply are what protects his legs, or kinemides, or greaves. These are a very important aspect to the hoplite's panoply, and arguably even more important than torso protection, as this is what goes and protects your lower half that your shield does not. We'll get onto that in a short while. These are an example of anatomical greaves, as we see the Greeks very much like anatomical armour. However, earlier on you would have also seen non-anatomical greaves. However, this does come in around the Archaic period and again survives into the Hellenistic. The method of attaching these specific styles seems to be the most common, which is simply a slip-on fit with self-clamping. However, we do sometimes see buckles or lace being added, perhaps to second-hand greaves to make them fit better, or just because this form of construction could probably be quite difficult to create. As mentioned before numerous times, the hoplites would have to afford and buy their own arms and armour, which means that perhaps a hoplite couldn't afford greaves, or they couldn't afford a muscle cuirass, or even a tube and yoke style armour. It's highly likely that actually a majority of hoplites that we saw on the battlefield were not this heavily armoured. In fact, all you really needed to have to be considered the hoplite is a spear and a shield, and preferably a helmet. Now, before we get on to the shield, perhaps the most important part of the hoplite's panoply, there are a few more weapons that I would just like to talk about, starting with here two lesser known and lesser interpreted weapons that the hoplites likely had, being javelins. We seem to see again in the Archaic period a far more sort of open form of warfare, and the actual whole way that the hoplites fight is not really well known or concrete, to say the least. Coming out more and more in the academic community is the idea that the Archaic era warfare of the hoplite was far more open, and one weapon that they seem to drop in the classical is the javelin. Now, these javelins are not like Olympic level javelins, they're not massive, and they're frankly not designed to be thrown particularly far. The furthest I've ever thrown these is around 85 feet, so that was one of the most powerful sort of throws that I've been able to do, so it's likely that most of these would only really be thrown 50-60 feet just before your armies engage. It's possible that these were still in use in the time of the Battle of Thermopylae, however it's not really possible for us to know, but this is just another weapon that we do see hoplites likely carrying, especially coming into the classical and the Archaic era. Next is the hoplite's main weapon, being the dory. Now, this is a rather interesting spear. It's roughly 8 feet, give or take. We sometimes see them longer or even shorter than this, but 8 feet sort of the standard. Now, it was a double-ended spear, that being with the iron acme at the front and the bronze ceruta at the back end, which translates to roughly lizard sticker, likely because they used to stab it in the ground. Another interesting construction method that we see, which isn't yet present on my reconstruction, I plan to add it very soon, is an actual distal taper on the shaft of the spear. This essentially counterweighted the spear. It allowed you to hold it further back than forward and also made the whole thing lighter. Now, why did it have two ends? Well, that is an interesting question. We have sort of a couple answers to this. It's sort of an ancient Greek multi-tool. So the acme, the iron spearhead, was the stabbing end. You would hold it like this and you would stab with that way. As for the purpose of having the double end, it's likely multiple reasons. One of the most useful, and again, it's bronze so it doesn't corrode, is that you can stab it in the ground and walk away from it. And this is incredibly helpful as you don't have to bend down and pick it up. You can simply grab it and be ready. This end is typically believed to be heavier. Our reconstructions, some of them are, some of them aren't, which again enforces that counterweight. It allows you to hold the spear further back than forward. You can also, if you really need to, use it as a secondary weapon in case this end gets cut off, However, that is a little impractical, as you would likely have a lot of excess spear sticking out that way, hitting all your friends. You can of course also use it to dispose of fallen enemies on the ground, so they don't poke your ankles, which isn't very nice. Now, there has been quite a lot of debate about whether you hold the spear overarm or underarm. However, basically universally agreed upon now in the academic and reenactment community is overarm, especially in formational combat. Of course, if you're not in formational combat, you're free to move however you want. However, when you have a guy tightly pressed up behind you, you need that back end up, and you can still get quite a lot of reach when you stab. Some people say you can't stab feet. Yes, you can. And another method that we can use to get an excess reach is a throw and catch method, where essentially you stab and let the spear slide. This was the most important weapon to the ancient Greek hoplite, and used with the Aspis was a very effective combo. Talking about the Aspis, let's move on to that. Now, this is perhaps the most important aspect to the hoplite. This is basically what made you a hoplite. Did you have an Aspis? Now, as a side note here, this shield is sometimes incorrectly called a hoplon. The word hoplite comes from the word equipment or arms, which is sometimes incorrectly labelled as the hoplon, being the shield. If you called the shield the hoplon, you're essentially calling your shield equipment. The term hoplite derives from that term, which essentially translates to meaning man-at-arms. The specific name of the shield was the Aspis, and there are a few characteristic elements that make the Aspis what it is. If you look at the shape of the Aspis, you can see that it's quite a large circle. They're around 36 inches average, however we do see some bigger than that. This one is a copy of the Vatican shield, which is an archaeological find, and this is made with scans of that shield, however slightly scaled up as that shield is slightly smaller. One of the major things that we see is that there's a dome construction with a rim. This actually allows the shield to quite ergonomically sit on your shoulder, and also, if the orthismos theory is correct, allows you to not get asphyxiated as you're crushed. Another major component of the shield is actually what's on the inside. Now, this is what we call a strap shield today, meaning that it's not a center gripped. You would have the, as you can see here, center sort of armband, which we call the porpax, with the antilabe going around. Now, on this specific example, the porpax is actually not in the center. It's slightly shifted up and to the right. We do see both in ancient Greek art, and this essentially does two major things. It puts your hand closer to the brim of the shield, which gives you more mobility, and also makes more of the shield jut out to the side, creating a stronger overlap for shield walls. One of the questions that we get asked the most is, what are these ropes for on the inside? And quite frankly, here's an answer that you probably won't like. We don't know. There's a lot of theories about this, being that it was a carrying cord that you can wear as a backpack, which some people have tested and it does seem to work. Others that it's just merely decoration, which, you know, it does look quite nice, especially if you have the little tassels hanging down. There's some which suggest that you can hold this in a shield wall to basically make it harder for you to split and separate, which I actually want to test this. I haven't been able to do that just yet. And there's another theory, which is it's essentially a throwback to older designed shields, that basically that was a structural part. Now, this shield covered the hoplite roughly from his neck to his knee, and that's where the helmet, and if you could afford them, greaves, sort of came into play. There is obviously one thing that's staring you straight in the face, that being what we call blazons, or the sort of emblem that sits on front of the shield. This is another area where we get asked a lot of questions, and again, I can give you multiple answers, some of which might be correct. We don't know. We see throughout lots of depictions of multiple different styles of blazons. We see some that seem to be religious, for instance, the eagle of Zeus, the owl of Athena, or even the solar symbol here is commonly associated with the god Apollo. We do have some literary mentions of uniformed shields, so for instance, the sacred band having the club of Heracles, and we do have maybe one or two mentions of the Spartan lambda. However, this is now more believed to have been a conscripted shield, a sort of Laconian residents that were forcefully conscripted into the Peloponnesian War were adorned with a lambda Laconian shield, so likely not actually used by the upper class Spartans themselves. And again, this sort of standardized blazon that we sort of start to see is a later addition and definitely doesn't seem to be very uniform. We also have descriptions of, for instance, a Spartan who painted the life-sized fly on his shield, again supporting the idea that it was individual choice. Maybe it was a family heirloom, it was sort of a heraldric symbol, but likely it was a multitude of all of these. But the short answer is that we don't really know for sure, so I can only really give you multiple answers to that question, all of which might not be correct, all of which could be correct, or some of them could be correct. We don't really know, but it seems to be a lot of variety and a lot of disparity in these shield blazons. So there you go, that is sort of a rundown of the arms and armour of the typical hoplite, and again, just to emphasise, there would have been a lot of hoplites that would have looked simply how I am right now. A spear and a shield, and nothing much else.